Hello ladies and gents, welcome to the third and final video in hashtag James the First week. Today we are finally going to have a look at the fallout of the King's assassination, the consequences of the assassination, what happened in the weeks after the King had been killed. Now you'll remember we left off on Thursday, I think it was, with the King dead, assassinated in a sewer beneath Blackfriars at Perth, and Queen Joan fleeing for her life, wounded into the darkness, away from the scene of the crime. Now, the plan of the assassins at this point is probably to try to get their hands on James's 7-year-old son, now of course James II. Now the younger James, the new king, is at Edinburgh Castle in the custody of a steward, Sir John Spens. Now Spens is obviously notionally in the employ of the royal administration. That's how he has the keeping of the young James II. But Spens is a man with associations with the Earl of Athol, Walter Earl of Athol, who you'll hopefully remember from the previous two videos was kind of the key ringleader in terms of bringing together the assassins and providing them with their opportunity to finish off James I. So it's quite possible that Athol expects that if he can come to Spens in the days after the assassination of King James, he can convince Spens to hand James II over to Athol as his great uncle, and now physically possessing the king, Athol can establish his own royal administration, can establish his own control over the government. That's probably the plan of the assassins, and that's part of the reason why it's reasonable to think that actually the plan initially is not just to kill James I, but to also kill Queen Joan. Because remember, James I had put plans in place that if he did die and left his son James II as a minor, it would be Joan who actually established the new royal administration and ran things on James's behalf until he became old enough to rule himself. But Joan escapes, and Joan makes a very quick journey, wounded though she is. She is hot off the marks. She travels from Perth, which is there, down to Edinburgh, and takes possession of James II, her son, the new king herself. She dismisses Spens and takes possession of the king herself. Now, possession of the king, of course, as Athol knew, provided a very powerful basis on which to set up a new government of Scotland, a new royal administration that Joan can now turn against the assassins. And that's what we see in the immediate aftermath of the King's assassination. We see Joan take possession of James II. She forms she gathers a royal council around herself, and she turns the administrative apparatus that surround this royal council, that surround this royal administration, to hunting down the rebels, to hunting down the assassins. And we get hints, now the details are a little bit uncertain, but we get hints that there is something of a minor civil war going on in Scotland in the later part of February and the beginning of March 1437. There is an armed manhunt for the people who were responsible for the king's death, and there are at least some efforts at resisting arrest from the likely assassins, people like Robert Graham, Robert Stewart, the Earl of Athol's grandson, and indeed Athol himself. Athol hauls himself up at his castle in Methven. That's quite close to Perth. Perth, remember, just about there on our map. But thanks to Queen Joan, thanks to her focus, thanks to her energy and vigour in terms of forming this new government and turning its attention, spearheading this effort into capturing the assassins. Within a month of the king's assassination, all of the assassins have been tracked down, and Walter, Earl of Athol, although he wasn't physically present for the assassination, and his grandson again, who had helped the assassins get into Blackfriars but who hadn't actually participated in the murder, they too have been arrested and they're all imprisoned, and they face trial before the king, the new king of course, James II, in Edinburgh. Now, although the assassins are brought to justice relatively quickly, although they are brought in relatively quickly, there still seems to be a perception that Perthshire, the area where Athol was strongest and where many of the disgruntled nobles who killed King James came from, there is, it seems, a perception on Joan's part and on the part of those who have formed up around her, men like the late king's nephews, William Douglas, second Earl of Angus, Archibald the 5th Earl of Douglas, another one of the king's nephews. There is a perception on the part of these men and Joan herself that Perthshire might still be a bit dangerous, might still be not the best place to send this new, vulnerable young king. And so, on the 25th of March, 1437, something happens that has never happened before in the history of Scotland. A new King of Scots is formally crowned, James II. Obviously, new Kings of Scots were crowned all the time. Even the fact that it is a coronation ceremony, a ceremony involving unction, that's been going on in Scotland since the coronation of David II, rather, in 1331. Actually, we may revisit why that year is a bit odd in a later video. I don't really have time to go into that now. So the coronation of a King of Scots is nothing new, but for the first time in history, a King of Scots is crowned not at Scone, which is of course near Perth, but at Holyrood Abbey in Edinburgh. Now, this is a remarkable break with tradition. Until this point, it has been seen as vitally important that a King of Scots is made a King of Scots at Scone. Even Robert Bruce, who is inaugurated in less than ideal circumstances, drags himself all the way up to Scone for the ceremony. But again, this break with tradition, this rather radical change, reflects the tensions that remain in the immediate aftermath of the death of James I. A real sense that the royal administration is doing its best to hold things together, but is somewhat nervy, somewhat concerned that there may still be anxious and aggressive elements present in Athol's old stomping ground in Perthshire that make it too dangerous, too much of a risk for the King of Scots, the new King of Scots. Remember, he's only 7-8 years old at this point. It's too dangerous. His guardians, his mother in particular, Joan, think to take him to the ancient and traditional inauguration and coronation site of Kings of Scots, and so King James is made king here in Edinburgh, just down the road at Holyrood Abbey. The day afterwards, he passes judgment, sits in judgment, and finds Athol to be a traitor and condemns him to death. Very important, of course, that that's the order that this happens in. The new king is made formally so that the judgment that is passed against Athol is not made by, or merely by, the royal administration, but by the minority administration rather, the minority government, but by the new king himself, advised, of course, by this minority government that Joan has set up around him. Now, the precise treatment of Athol and Robert Stewart and Robert Graham are, I suppose, a little bit uncertain. What is certain is that they're all executed. Surprise, surprise. What other result would one expect for individuals found guilty of treason, no less? We have some very lurid, some very graphic, some very violent descriptions of the torments that that these individuals suffer. All kinds of tortures devised. Robert Graham made to watch as his son is mutilated with the knife that he used to kill, or to stab at least, James I. Those accounts are later and dramatic and may not necessarily give the true story, as it were, but certainly all of them were executed. All of them fall victim to the royal justice, the royal authority that they have so flagrantly and dramatically flouted by assassinating, by murdering the king. So, a couple of things worthy of note here. First of all, the person on whose shoulders the, I don't want to say blame, the responsibility for this swift and quite terminal ending of the assassins and the conspiracy against King James and his royal administration. The responsibility for that swift and brutal response lies pretty much exclusively on the shoulders of Joan. If Joan hadn't reacted the way she had, hadn't been so focused and hadn't been so shrewd in how she responded to this rather dramatic challenge to the integrity of the Scottish royal administration, James's royal administration in 1437, we may have seen a very different outcome. We may have seen outright long-standing civil war. We may in fact have seen the rebels, Athol and co, actually seizing power, actually accomplishing their goals and establishing their own minority government that saw Joan driven back to England or who knows what. But Joan does not falter. She responds in absolutely the right way to accomplish her ends. She is focused, she is driven, she is energetic in her response. She rallies the Scottish political community behind the cause of their late king. She even, for example, displays the body of her late husband, the mutilated, murdered corpse of James I, to the papal nuncio, a visiting papal dignitary, the Bishop of Urbino, who provides for her this very emotive description of the king's corpse that can be used, of course, for propaganda purposes by the new administration. He describes the king as being a martyr for the Commonwealth of Scotland. This is very powerful language for Joan to use to rally support around the hunt for her husband's killers. So there is no denying that if not for Joan, the outcome, the aftermath of the king's assassination would be very, very different. It's also worth pointing out that the crisis is dealt with, as I intimated in that first point, very, very quickly. The essential conservatism of the Scottish political community really comes to the royal administration's rescue. As I mentioned in the first video, James is hardly a popular king. Nobody in the Scottish political community really likes paying for the king's expensive tastes and his ambitious projects. The Scots like kingship on the cheap. They like kings that live off their own resources. They don't like kings that want to take all of your money and spend it on palaces and cannons and castles and all the rest of it. So James is not necessarily, and certainly his policies are not necessarily popular among the Scottish political community. However, the notion that you could overthrow a king, could assassinate a king, stab him to death and then seize power is completely anathema to the Scots in the medieval period, or most of them. Obviously the ones that try to do it, it's not so outlandish to them, but to the community as a whole, the community would, generally speaking, much rather, it seems from this example, and of course there are other examples, some of which we'll look at in subsequent videos, it would seem that the Scottish political community would by and large much rather cooperate even with quite unpopular kings and their policies, rather than have sudden, violent, unexpected changes to the status quo. Now that leads us on to a final point here, because that inherent conservatism comes back to bite Joan in a big way once we move out of the short term, once the crisis is over, once we've moved into kind of the mid and later term consequences of the assassination of the king. Because, as I mentioned, in the immediate aftermath of the king's death, Joan takes over the royal administration, is crucial in ensuring that the royal administration survives and that the assassins are brought to justice. Once that immediate crisis is dealt with, however, Joan is basically muscled out of the royal administration in favour of a far more straightforward, far more conservative choice. In the aftermath of James's coronation and the execution of James II's coronation, of course, and the execution of the assassins, one of those royal nephews I mentioned, Archibald, 5th Earl of Douglas, is appointed by the community, by the consent of the community, to serve as Lieutenant General of the Kingdom on behalf of the young King James. And Joan is left with physical possession of her son still. She's still his guardian in effect, but the government, actual administrative authority, is in effect taken away from her. Now, as I say, this is a fundamentally conservative choice on the part of the Scottish political community. Joan is both a woman and English. Hard to say, really, which of those the Scottish political community finds more disconcerting, really. Archibald, on the other hand, Douglas, comes from a family with long-standing connections to the politics of the kingdom, has a family name that resonates very strongly, particularly with the defence of the realm. The Douglases, by this period in history, are increasingly thinking of themselves as the war wall of Scotland, the family that keeps the English at bay and keeps Scotland's borders safe. More importantly than any of that sexism and anti-English feeling, though, the thing that really counts against Joan in this period is that she fundamentally is associated with the dead king's policies. Remember those unpopular policies, those expensive policies that the Scots felt, the Scottish political community at least, the Scottish nobility felt were bleeding them dry. The Scots, it seems, the Scots who had influence over these things, who could affect the direction of government, were quite happy to follow Joan's lead when it came to righting the wrongs of February 1437. They were less than enthusiastic about letting her reinstitute and continue and develop and perhaps expand the late king's decidedly unwelcome attitudes towards royal finance and policies with regard to royal magnate relations. Now, as we will undoubtedly see in subsequent videos, that was not the end of Joan's story either. She continued to press for greater control over the royal administration, greater influence in government for the rest of her days. She dies in 1445, and she is still then making problems for the royal administration, the minority government of her son James II. But I think that's probably better saved for a later video. So, ladies and gents, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed these 3 videos, and I hope they do kind of tie together a little bit and give you a kind of sense of the events as they unfolded in 1437, and also some of their significance. Any feedback I'm more than happy to receive. Do feel free to comment down below, or on whatever social media platform you first stumbled across this video. Like and subscribe, and I promise I will see you soon for more 14th and or 15th century Scottish history videos. Thank you, ladies and gents.